Sudan is located in the northeastern parts of Africa, and the name itself derives from an Arabic expression which translates into land of the blacks. Sudan has been in colonial holding as well as independent. However, Sudan has always included their neighbor country, South Sudan, which is a home to many different sub-Saharan ethnic groups. Sudan was before 2011, before the Arab Spring, the largest African country, which represented more than 8% of the African continent and 2% of the world's land area. Sudan is one of the poorest countries, but also one of the least developed countries in the world. Many inhabitants are still dependent on farming to be able to support their families economically. Even though farming has lowered in amount, it still accounts for about 1/3 of the gross domestic product of Sudan. The main crops of Sudan include cotton, peanuts, gum arabic, and sugar canes. The Sudan-Chinese relations go back to 1959, when Sudan became the first sub-Saharan country to recognize China. Since 1995, Sudan has been under U.S. sanctions, partly due to the country's past ties with terrorists like Osama bin Laden. During 1995, President Omar al-Bashir signed Sudan's first oil deal with China. The oil production began, as stated before, in the late 1990s, and petroleum quickly became Sudan's most important export. In earlier years, the West had worked to isolate the Sudanese government for both abuses of human rights and terrorism support. Then, in 1997, the state-owned China National Petroleum Corporation, along with other Asian oil companies, signed an oil development deal with the Sudanese government. Enemies of Khartoum, especially the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, fought the government in the south and said that China was enabling an autocratic regime. They also argued that the Chinese-financed oil investments were tied to mass displacement and human rights violations. The Darfur issue, also known as the War in Darfur, is a huge armed conflict in the Darfur region of Sudan that began in 2003. When the Sudan Liberation Movement and the Justice and Equality Movement, which are two rebel groups, began fighting the government of Sudan. The reason for them starting the fight was due to the fact that they felt an oppression of Darfur's non-Arabic population. The government responded with an ethical cleansing against Darfur's non-Arabs. This cleansing resulted in the death of more than 100,000 civilians and the prosecution of Sudan's president, Omar al-Bashir. By the International Criminal Court, Omar al-Bashir was prosecuted on several points, amongst genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The Darfur War had two sides, one with the rebels, which primarily recruited people from the non-Arab Muslim Fur Saghaba and Masalit ethnic groups, and one with the police and military groups, one of which is known as the Janjaweed. The Janjaweed are a military group that operates in the western of Sudan and eastern Chad. Since the Darfur conflict started in 2003, they have been one of the main players, which has led to battles over resources and land. The militants have not only fought against the rebels, but they have also terrorized civilians in the area and prevented international aid organizations from helping in regards to needed food and medical supplies. The Sudanese government and the Justice and Equality Movement, also called JEM, signed an agreement for a ceasefire in 2010.
China is the biggest trade partner for Sudan, dominating the sub-Saharan country's export and import market, together with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. This ties in with the United States and West's negligence of both economic and diplomatic relations with Sudan. In 1995, the US imposed trade sanctions and restrictions on the country due to its ties to the likes of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. The same year, China and Sudan signed its first deal on oil. Today, China controls around 75% of the Sudanese oil industry, following a period of intense investment in the country. The period of 2010 to 2018 saw Sudan's GDP grow from 65 billion to 120 billion, in large due to foreign money, particularly from China. As such, the Sudanese government has made it a priority to expand domestic oil production. Ibrahim Gandour, foreign minister in Sudan between 2015 and 2018, told magazine The Diplomat, China's first experience in investing in Africa was in Sudan, and that they started in oil but now have other interests in trade, mining, as well as construction. Yet Sudan is as well currently in what might be a watershed moment for the country. After the 2018 and 2019 protests, resulting in around 250 deaths, al-Bashir's 30-year-long rule came to an end. A transitionary period took its beginning in August of 2019, with Abdallah Hamdok leading the temporary government until the 2022 general election. Hamdok has promised a permanent shift to democracy and began his term by ousting all ministers and chancellors affiliated with al-Bashir's autocratic National Congress Party, as well as lifting laws restricting and discriminating the rights of women. For South Sudan, the future is still uncertain. The peace agreement signed by the government and opposition leaders in September of 2018 staked out an 8-month-long pre-transitionary period, followed by a 36-month-long transition period, concluding with full independence for South Sudan. Implementation of the agreement has faced serious delays, and skirmishes between Sudanese government forces and South Sudan troops continue. In South Sudan, local militias and infighting between the country's regional power players have plagued humanitarian and official efforts to provide stability and security. The proposed 2022 election, to be held simultaneously as the general election in Sudan, also provides further possibilities for fragmentation and volatility in both countries. China's deep influence over the ongoing peace process in an attempt to secure its economic, diplomatic, and security interests has meant abandoning its long-standing policy of non-interference in Africa. After civil war broke out between Sudan and South Sudan in 2013, China proved a willing mediator and brought together the two warring parties for a first sit-down in 2015. Although little happened to bring about peace during the talks, both parties quickly agreed not to attack central oil infrastructure, realizing that their economies live and die by the influx of Chinese investments. Even if Sudan and South Sudan manage to achieve democracy and public representation, the influence of China is likely to continue being a major factor in the decision-making of the two countries. As South Sudanese hip-hop star Emmanuel Jal stated, there isn't a party in Africa that doesn't like them, the Chinese.
Ever since China started to take on the role of a world actor, they have kept closely to their policy of non-interference, seeking economical gains without becoming entangled with the politics of other countries. This, however, is starting to change, and one of the clearest examples of China's abandonment of their non-interference policy can be found in the Sudan-South Sudan region. As mentioned, China has invested a lot of money into the Sudanese oil business, and after South Sudan gained their independence in 2015, China continued to keep a close connection with the region. In 2012, the trade between the two countries equaled about $8,534 million, and in 2013, about 100 different Chinese companies were registered in South Sudan. And although South Sudan's oil exports only equal about 2 to 5% of China's oil imports, its political significance for China should not be underestimated. The Chinese involvement in Sudan's oil industry was the CNPC, Chinese Natural Petrol Corporation's, first overseas success, and oil from Sudan greatly contributed to China's economic growth during the oil boom between 1998 and 2003. So the Sudanese oil, most of which is today located in South Sudan, has a great symbolic importance for China. South Sudan is also viewed as a bit of a paradise for Chinese investors because of its oil. It also has huge infrastructure needs, and there are also very few to no Western competitors. So when the South Sudanese civil war broke out in 2013, China was reluctant to evacuate and pull out of the country, as it had done before. IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is the regional body of the Horn of Africa, began launching mediating efforts between the government and the rebels immediately after the breakout of the conflict, and both China and the West backed these efforts. This in itself is a step outside of China's regular policy. While China avoided setting agendas, proposing agreements or placing demands, as well as principally refusing to use sanctions, they have been using their significant economical power and political ties to the region to bring the Sudanese government together with the rebels and playing a mediating role. An example of such a meeting took place in Ethiopia in 2015, where China brought together government, rebels, and IGAD, as well as Sudan, for discussion. Oil is South Sudan's biggest exporting good, and the majority of the oil they export goes to China. A large amount of oil investment also comes from Chinese companies. This gives China an extensive leverage over South Sudan, as without their investments and buying of oil, the South Sudanese oil industry would cease to function, which would lead to a collapse of the country's economy as a whole. It is thus in the interest of both rebels and government alike to please China and make sure that they stay in the country, giving China leverage that Western countries simply do not have. China has also been able to leverage loans and credits to be able to bring the two parties together for discussion. They've also been playing a game of good cop, bad cop with regards to sanctions, taking an active stance against imposing them, and instead taking on the role of a mediator between the West and South Sudan, which gives them power while still seeming to be on South Sudan's side, not against them. An example of this is how they, in 2013, used the US threats of sanctions to get the South Sudanese government to release a number of members from IJAD that were being kept prisoners. But the question then is why China is and has been taking on this role in South Sudan, as it is so clearly outside of their foreign policy. Part of the reason is, of course, the oil. As shown in previous evacuations of Chinese citizens without getting involved in the conflict, as in Libya in 2011, the non-interference policy has distinct limits when it comes to protecting economic investments and infrastructure in the conflict-stricken area. In Libya in 2011, the largest evacuation of Chinese citizens in the country's history took place. But although all Chinese citizens were removed from the country, infrastructure projects built with Chinese investments up to $8.8 billion were destroyed. So perhaps learning from Libya, China decided to remain in South Sudan instead of evacuating, and instead trying to mediate a peace, to safeguard current economic investments and enable future ones in the country. One can also speculate that South Sudan is a good scene for trying out this new foreign policy. As China's economic power grows, so does their ability to influence world politics, and as Chinese actions in Africa are much less scrutinized in Chinese media than their actions in the Asian region, South Sudan seems a relatively risk-free area to try their diplomatic legs. Being actively involved in mediating peace will also perhaps work to increase China's influence in South Sudan further, potentially also enabling them to start spreading their political ideologies. But while one can question China's ulterior motives for suddenly starting to become a diplomatic force, one can also see that, at least in South Sudan and in the African region in general, their immense economic influence grants them substantially more power than the West to efficiently extract pressure, bring parties together, and attempt a mediating process for peace.
The economic support for China to Sudan has a network of financial profit for China. In 2018, the Chinese government donated $58 million American dollars to Sudan for what they claimed was internal affairs. Also for Sudan to recover from their civil war that had ended that same year, when Sudan finally declared what they would call the final peace, this one being the one that Sudan hopes will last. The economical benefits China gains from the investment into the country is the so-called cooperation with the oil industry, and by making sure of peace, they can resume their use of Sudan's resources without the interruption of civil war. Shadowing China's wish for a less war-ridden country is the veto China has over Sudan. This means that the former dictator of Sudan, Omar Hassan Ahmed al-Bashir, who was forced to abdicate after 36 years of reigning by its own people, could essentially do whatever he wanted with his country. This international power is crimping the UN, and the US is yearning to help Sudan with the peacemaking measures. Leading back to China, this entails a power over Sudan that not only dominates their industries, but politics too. Strictly from a short-sighted financial perspective, the Chinese would like to have the war to be ended with the supposed final peace that was before the final peace. However, by granting the former dictator of Sudan advantages, China could continue their leeching on the economy. China had to offer Sudan something more to manage their relationship on a friendly chapter. something more than money. That is. As a result of the overthrow of al-Bashir, China subsequently started an initiation of peace in Sudan by sending in peacekeeping soldiers and remaining steadily in their support for the peace talks during the final peace. So it seems like China's international policy is a two-faced one, only working in the favor of itself. China's officially spoken out about their economic benefits gained from the so-called internal affairs they have in Sudan. They claim that it benefits both China and Sudan, ignoring to comment on the fact that China dominates the so-called Sudan oil industry. An article in The Diplomat explains that even before South Sudan had its independence, China had a monopoly over the oil sector in Sudan. And now, one can only imagine the influence China has on the young nation, with them owing China over $50 million. Xi Jinping has spoken out about the loans and donations to South Sudan. A morally sounding speech from the Chinese president is pretty transparent of their true intentions. Sovereignty, security, and stability, and oppose foreign interference in Sudan's internal affairs. It's fairly easy to detect the transparency in this speech, one of a selfish nature. Although, looking at the GDP of Sudan, one can see a tremendous increase. This graph shows the GDP of Sudan after the civil war, and with that, the investments of China into Sudan. This looks really good for China and, of course, for Sudan. Although the HDI, the Human Development Index, this is also looked upon as very different. There has been little to no growth in the HDI from the 1900s to 2018. This shows the little positive impact the loans and the development of China has had on the average Sudanese person. The money that it's invested into Sudan from China is most likely benefiting China more than Sudan, returning straight into the pocket of the Chinese government. This being a far throw from what Xi Jinping claimed the loans would do for Sudan. The wish of China developing Sudan stretches over a vast network of trade and transport. The Belt Road Initiative is a goal of the Chinese government. It is a wish for the Chinese government to expand their trade as far and as easily as possible, and this is easiest through Africa, and in this case Sudan and South Sudan. And the Sudanese people are not the only ones paying for China's wish to sell more goods and services. It's all over Africa. As many of us already know, China has a way of using its power over countries in dire need of help, using them as a vehicle to initiate themselves into a country with money and gaining enough power that the sole source of help is only for that certain country could only be China.
China is Sudan's biggest trade partner. They import oil while exporting low-cost items to Sudan. The Sudanese government is by many human rights movements accused of arming militias in the Darfur War. Human rights organizations have therefore criticized China for its supporting relationship with the government of Sudan. According to a report released by Human Rights Watch, China today poses an existential threat to the international human rights system. The Chinese government has allegedly attempted to track and deport journalists and foreign investigators who report on forced indoctrination and detention of at least 1 million Uyghur Muslims. Chinese state media also reported that the region of Tibet would introduce regulations to strengthen ethnic unity. The Chinese government has built special camps for Uyghur Muslims where the Muslims are trained to forget their religion by being forced to, for example, eat pork and eat during Ramadan. Uyghurs are ethnically Turkic Muslims, and there are about 11 million of them in Western China. The Uyghurs identify themselves as the original inhabitants of Xinjiang, which they describe as East Turkestan. China's government claims these camps are made for preventing terrorism in the country. They see the Uyghur Muslims in the country as terrorists, and you can today be sent to one of the camps for just showing any signs of being a Muslim, such as wearing a hijab or a beard, or praying. China says the camps are training centers to equip people with employable skills to help combat Islamist extremism in the Xinjiang province. Beijing has enforced harsher regulations against Uyghurs and raised the security budget for Xinjiang, which has led to increased tensions between the Uyghur and the majority Han Chinese in the past few years. Violent clashes broke out between Han and Uyghur communities in July 2009, killing at least 197 people. Another wave of violence swept across the region in 2012, forcing many Uyghurs to flee China. Rights groups have also claimed that Chinese authorities have executed several of them in the past. Uyghurs and Kazakhs outside China have told The Guardian their family members in Xinjiang remain held in the camps. Those who are not in the camps are subject to constant surveillance, including having Chinese officials living in their homes and live under the threat of being sent to a center. A Human Rights Watch report highlights Beijing's efforts to deter the international community from scrutinizing its human rights abuses, taking full advantage of the corporate quest for profit and extend its censorship to critics abroad. Several African leaders have defended China's act against Uyghur Muslims. Ambassadors from Muslim countries in Asia and Africa, such as Qatar, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, and many other countries, signed a letter where Beijing was praised for their human rights achievements. Also, Sudan signed this letter, despite the big population of Muslims in their country. The other African states that signed the letter in support of the large-scale arbitrary detentions are also entangled economically with China.